to my NFL prediction show where we go through every single NFL division and I give you a prediction of what I expect from each NFL team in that division. So far, we've done the NFC North, the AFC East, and I believe the AFC South by now you should have seen. And now we have the NFC South, and I think this division is pretty straightforward, if you ask me, honestly, because I feel that there's only really 1 to 2 teams that could genuinely make a playoff run, or really even make the playoffs, and I know that might upset a certain fan base or two. Even if you get upset that I don't talk about your team that much, leave a comment down below, not yelling at me, but just politely ask to make a video on them, and I actually do love making video ideas from y'all's comments. And while you're scrolling down there, go ahead and hit that sub button. I know I'm just like every other YouTuber asking, but I feel like it's my duty to at least politely ask because it really does make my day, and we are on the road to 1,000 subs. But if you don't know how these division prediction videos go, basically the last place team will be talked about first, and the first place team will be talked about last. And at the end of the video, I'll give you an overall view, and a graphic will pop up of what the records will look like and how they turn out overall for the entire NFC. But let's not waste any time here. Let's start with the last place team in the NFC South. It's the Atlanta Falcons. I hope I'm not breaking anybody's hearts by putting the Falcons here. It's no disrespect to that franchise overall, and hopefully they get over the choking curse. But here's the thing with the Falcons that I think is abundantly true across the league. They are not talented enough to win NFL football games at a high level yet. This is a rebuild. They accepted that once they traded Matt Ryan this past year, and we're trying to make a move for Deshaun Watson, which is one of the weirdest what-ifs of all time if we go look back at it, just because really, what did the Falcons have to offer for Deshaun if he were to actually play? Now, hopefully he gets banned for 2 years, and don't argue with me on that one, but I do think overall, you're hoping for the best case scenario with the Falcons right now with this roster is, A, you hope that the offense is at least formidable with Arthur Smith at the helm. You don't know what you have with him, and he could potentially be a coach that's being moved off of at the end of the season. Now, whether or not you think that's fair to him because of the situation that he's been put in, obviously the management has not been great in putting a roster around, and I do think Arthur Smith could be a good coordinator moving forward. It's the same thing with Robert Saleh. He might be a better coordinator than he is as a head coach, which is no disrespect to him. It's just way more difficult to be a head coach in the NFL, and there's way more eyes on you. But I think overall with this team, you hope that potentially Desmond Ridder could be a guy that could actually step in. I think he will get some playing time this year. Obviously, Marcus Mariota was a buy low, potentially sell high guy that could easily be a good quarterback if he is in the right offense. Obviously, last time he was in an Arthur Smith offense, he got benched, so expectations you got to manage a little bit. But I hope that potentially they have the quarterback of the future on the roster, because if you put Bryce Young or CJ Stroud in this upcoming draft in this situation with a terrible offensive line and no defense, they're going to struggle no matter what. And hopefully you have the quarterback on the roster that can at least make this offense at potentially just below average to average. Then you can go get a guy like Will Anderson to really revamp this defense, and then you're on the road to a really solid rebuild. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're in the realm of getting a quarterback this April. But we'll talk about that team more once we get there. I don't think this team will be good. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me on that one. I don't think they're going to be even a dark horse to a wild card. This is going to be a bottom feeder team. Everyone understands that. But let's move to a polarizing team that I think could really either shock the NFL or meet the expectations of a lot of haters. It's the Carolina Panthers. By no means do I hate the Carolina Panthers. I want to make that very clear. I think that this team is relatively solid with Baker Mayfield at the helm, but they have not confirmed that he's going to be the starter. Matt Corral has shocked a lot of people. Sam Darnold is in a competition with Baker, and Matt Corral is doing everything in his power to throw a wrench into all of that. And a lot of this team is based on health. Whether or not that this team can stay healthy. Christian McCaffrey with this team makes it really interesting, makes him potentially dark horse. I don't have a lot of faith that he will stay healthy because it's been such a coin flip over the past couple of years. Whether or not this offensive line will hold up with, I believe, I can't remember who they got. I know it was the NC State kid. It was Ike Okongwu, who they got. I think he could be really good in the running game. Whether or not they have a running back to run behind, that's another question. Because outside of Christian McCaffrey is Chuba Hubbard, a guy that could really step into a nice role. DJ Moore has become one of the most underrated. Well, I think we have all come to accept that he's not underrated anymore. He's just waiting to have a good quarterback on his team. Is Robbie Anderson going to retire? Who's their tight end right now? is Matt Rule a good head coach? Like, I have all these questions about this roster when it comes to offensive line, health. Is their coaching even that good? Brian Burns is a good bright spot. I think that JC Horn could really step into a nice role with this team. But outside of those guys on this defense, I know there's a safety that was playing really damn good, but I have too many questions for this team to put them anywhere other than third place in this division and right outside a wild card spot. Because there's too many questions. I don't like that going into a season. Maybe they put it all together, but it's really difficult to do that midway through the season. We saw with the Bengals midway through last year, and I know a lot of people want to make these comparisons to teams to the Bengals that can make these shocking playoff runs. We hadn't seen a team like the Bengals go from zero to hero like that in a very long time. Like, it is so difficult to turn that switch. And you usually have to have a stable quarterback or know who your quarterback is going into week one. And no one really knows. Like, we all assume it's going to be Baker versus the Browns. But are we 100% sure that Matt Rule is going to make that? Because I feel like if we were 100% sure, he would have came up to that podium and be like, we just traded for this guy. He's going to play. I don't know. And there's too many variables with the Panthers for me to put them anywhere other than 3. And we'll move on to the second place team. A team that I think also has probably one of the biggest ceilings to lowest floors is the New Orleans Saints. Like the Panthers, there's so many questions with the Saints. As I try to go through my head and try to think of all the potential things that could happen with these two teams, because the number one team, obviously the one that's been left out of this conversation, is the Bucs. I think the Bucs have a lot more questions answered versus the Saints and the Panthers. When we look at the Saints, obviously they have a quarterback going into week one. That's a plus. Jameis Winston has looked really good, but over the past couple weeks and really last year, obviously you have a torn ACL, which is heartbreaking because he was playing some damn good football under Sean Payton. Obviously, Sean Payton's gone now. You have a defensive head coach, which has always, historically, not always gone great over the past couple years. Now, it's very curious on how dynamic this offense is going to look. Obviously, Michael Thomas is a question. What are the expectations for Michael Thomas? In my opinion, I'm drafting him in every single fantasy round just because I think that he could really have a breakout year with a good quarterback. Jameis Winston has looked really solid in training camp. That's a good sign. Even though he rolled his ankle, I still think Jameis Winston could be a really solid quarterback. Not elite, though. As well as Alvin Kamara, who could potentially be suspended midway through the season. That could be a huge loss. And then outside of, I would say, Michael Thomas, it's not as shaky as it used to be. Jarvis Landry and Chris Olave are two guys I was very high on that could potentially be getting 7 targets at least a game. That's huge. The defense was humming last year. Even though they're very much an older defense, I still think the defense is going to be relatively same, and that's what I think is the biggest plus with the New Orleans Saints. The defense is going to stay consistent because they just moved their defensive coordinator to head coach. The offense is the biggest variable, and I think that's what makes it so much of a gap when it comes to their floor and their ceiling. I think that's the biggest gap. If their offense is really good, this team could be potentially winning the division. I wouldn't be shocked if they won the division because there's a couple questions with the Bucs, which I'll get into in a minute. But if their offense is subpar, not as good, we'll be in the same situation of a potential 9-8 team, such as like last year. Like, they did a lot of good things. Obviously, the offensive line is a big question in my opinion. I think if they can have a good enough offensive line for Jameis Winston to sit in the pocket and make steady throws, this offense could be really good with health. Alvin Kamara has to be healthy, as well as Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas. If they lose any of those guys, it gets really, really concerning for the Saints moving forward. I'm excited for them. I think the Saints will be an interesting team. And I'm honestly have thought about making an entire video on this team because of what to expect. I did not love the Trevor Penning pick. He's been one of the more talked about players during training camp because of what he has done. I understand wanting to be a mauler, but he's going to injure a teammate sooner or later. I think that the offensive line is the key piece in all of this. Obviously with coaching, but there's only so much you can handle when it comes to coaching. But the offensive line and health is what's going to really make or break for the Saints this season. With coaching, I keep mentioning it because going from Sean Payton to someone else is a big gap. No matter who you're swapping to, even if it's a guy that's in your building, I think Sean Payton of very highly, especially for a guy that could really run an offense. So I'm concerned for that overall. That's why I'm not putting them in first place and making a bold take. But we will talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Tom Brady. I will say, with Tom Brady potentially retiring after this year, I'm very curious what the expectations for the Bucs. We haven't talked about, or at least from what I've seen on TikTok and on YouTube and on ESPN and things like that, we talked about the injuries. Obviously, you lose I would say a potential all-pro center to a season-ending injury. Ryan Jensen, heartbreaking. I believe they just lost Russell Gage and their backup center, so they're almost having a what would you say, a Baltimore Ravens running back revolving door at the center position. I think that the expectations for the Bucs have to be managed. Do I think that they could be a really good regular season team? Absolutely. Do I think that they could be a potential deep playoff run team? I'm a little more hesitant to, but I think that they'll easily be in contention just because they're in the NFC. They're not dealing with the Chiefs, the Bills, the entire AFC West, actually, or even the AFC North. They don't have to deal with that. So I think they'll have a pretty damn good seeding. I'd be concerned when we get to the playoffs, what are the expectations? Because obviously they did not look great against the Rams. Even though they made that game close, they did not look great. I think that the running game is going to have to be crucial, and the defense is going to have to step up with the less weapons being on the roster. Obviously, you bring in Julio Jones, that's a big deal. I believe Chris Godwin's going to be on the PUP list for a little bit, or the PUP list. Mike Evans is going to be Mike Evans at the end of the day. So the offensive line, the defense has to step up, but I believe that it will. Going from Bruce Arians, though, to Todd Bowles, it's a kind of the same thing with the Saints, man. I think that one of these two teams is not going to work out because of the head coaching change. Now, obviously, with Tom Brady at the helm, he's kind of a part coach. He wanted to do that with the Dolphins, so I think that it's not as big of a loss, but people aren't talking about it enough, so it could be an underrated excuse on why this team does not do as well in the regular season versus the playoffs. I think they have the depth for the playoffs, but whether or not they actually make that deep run will actually depend on matchups, so we'll go through that during my Super Bowl prediction show. But if you're at this point in the video, here's what the NFC South is going to look like in my opinion. I think it's pretty straightforward on where the teams are going to go. But I think what gets interesting about the NFC South are the teams that make the playoffs. What do they do from that point forward? And we'll talk about that at a later date. But thank you so much for watching. Leave a sub, leave a like. We're almost at school, so thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.